Soldiers celebrate July 4th in 1943. But decades later, a detail in the photo left everyone speechless. Sometimes a single photograph can challenge everything we think we know about history. What if I told you that a seemingly innocent picture of American soldiers celebrating Independence Day in 1943 contains a detail so disturbing that it has left military historians, genealogists, and World War II experts completely baffled for decades? Today, we're diving into one of the most perplexing photographic mysteries of World War II, a group photo taken at Camp Shelby, Mississippi on July the 4th, 1943. For 70 years, this image sat quietly in family albums and military archives. But when modern researchers began examining it closely, they discovered something that should have been impossible. Someone who, according to official military records, could not have been there that day. If you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And by the way, I'm also developing another channel focused on unsolved military mysteries. I'll share more about that soon. Get ready for a story that will make you question the reliability of official records and wonder just how many secrets from the past remain hidden in plain sight. The summer of 1943 was a pivotal moment in World War II. Allied forces had successfully invaded Sicily. The tide was turning in the Pacific, and morale among American troops was higher than it had been since Pearl Harbor. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, one of the largest military training installations in the United States, over 85,000 soldiers were preparing for deployment to various theaters of war. Camp Shelby, established in 1917 and reactivated for World War II, sprawled across 134,000 acres of pine forests and rolling hills in southern Mississippi. The base served as a training ground for infantry divisions, with soldiers arriving from across the country to undergo rigorous preparation before shipping out to fight in Europe and the Pacific. On July 4, 1943, the commanding officers at Camp Shelby had organized a special Independence Day celebration. It was both a morale booster and a propaganda opportunity. Photographers from Life magazine and various military publications were present to document American soldiers celebrating freedom while preparing to defend it abroad. First, Lieutenant Robert Morrison, a 24-year-old photographer from the Army Signal Corps, was tasked with documenting the day's festivities. Morrison, who had studied photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology before being drafted, approached his assignment with professional enthusiasm. He understood the historical importance of capturing these moments. Young American men celebrating what might be their last Independence Day on home soil. The celebration began at dawn with reveille played by the camp's brass band, followed by a flag-raising ceremony attended by thousands of soldiers. The massive American flag, measuring 20 by 38 feet, was raised against the backdrop of a perfect Mississippi morning. Clear blue skies and temperatures that promised to climb into the high 80s by afternoon. By mid-morning, various recreational activities were in full swing across the base. There were baseball games, boxing matches, relay races, and impromptu musical performances. Soldiers who had been professional musicians in civilian life formed temporary bands, playing everything from patriotic marches to popular swing tunes of the era. It was around 2:30 p.m. during the peak of the afternoon festivities that Lieutenant Morrison captured the photograph that would become one of the most puzzling military images in American history. The location was the main recreational area near the base's central headquarters, where a large group of soldiers from the 37th Infantry Division had gathered around a makeshift stage where a jazz quartet was performing. The 37th Infantry Division, known as the Buckeye Division due to its origins in Ohio, had arrived at Camp Shelby in May 1943 for intensive jungle warfare training. These men were preparing for deployment to the Pacific Theater, specifically for operations in the Solomon Islands. The division was composed primarily of National Guard units that had been federalized, meaning many of the soldiers had known each other as civilians before the war. Morrison positioned himself on a slight elevation using a standard 455 speed graphic camera loaded with black and white film. The composition was classic military photography of the era, a wide shot that captured both the organized nature of military life and the humanity of the soldiers enjoying a rare moment of celebration. In the center of the frame, Sergeant James Mitchell from Toledo, Ohio, had his arm around Private Danny Kowalski from Cleveland, both men laughing at something off camera. Behind them, Corporal William Bill Henderson from Akron was lighting a cigarette, his sergeant's stripes clearly visible on his rolled-up sleeves. To the right, a group of 5 soldiers were engaged in an animated conversation, their faces showing the relaxed expressions that only came during these precious moments away from training. The background showed the typical architecture of a World War II military base: long wooden barracks, administrative buildings with corrugated metal roofs, and the ever-present water tower painted with the base's identification numbers. American flags hung from virtually every building, and patriotic bunting decorated the makeshift performance stage. Morrison took 3 shots of this particular scene, adjusting his position slightly between frames to capture different angles. The soldiers, accustomed to military photographers, mostly ignored his presence, continuing their conversations and celebrations naturally. This candid quality would later prove crucial to the photograph's historical value and its mysterious nature. After the festivities concluded that evening, Morrison developed his film in the base's photography laboratory. The images were sharp, well-composed, and captured the spirit of American soldiers celebrating their nation's independence even as they prepared for the harsh realities of combat. Several of the photographs, including the problematic one, were selected for publication in military magazines and newspapers. The 37th Infantry Division shipped out from Camp Shelby just 2 weeks later, on July 18, 1943. Many of the soldiers in Morrison's photographs would see combat in the Solomon Islands campaign, participating in bloody battles at New Georgia, Bougainville, and eventually the Philippines. Some would return home as heroes. Others would never see American soil again. Lieutenant Morrison himself was transferred to the European theater in September 1943, serving as a combat photographer during the Italian campaign. His photographs from Camp Shelby were filed in the military archives, copies distributed to families and veterans organizations, and several published in various military publications throughout the remainder of the war. For decades, the July 4, 1943 photograph remained exactly what it appeared to be: a snapshot of American soldiers enjoying a brief respite from the grim business of preparing for war. Family members treasured copies. Military historians included it in books about Camp Shelby and the 37th Infantry Division, and it became part of the visual record of American military life during World War II. No one noticed anything unusual about the image. No one had any reason to look closer. The photograph showed exactly what everyone expected to see: young American soldiers celebrating Independence Day in 1943, their faces full of hope and determination, unaware of the battles that lay ahead. But photographs, like all historical documents, sometimes reveal their secrets only when viewed with fresh eyes and new information. And in the case of Lieutenant Morrison's July 4th image, the secret it contained would prove to be deeply disturbing. Dr. Amanda Foster had always been fascinated by World War II photography. As a military historian at the University of Mississippi and the author of 3 books on wartime documentation, she had spent over 20 years analyzing thousands of photographs from various conflicts. Her specialty was using modern digital enhancement techniques to extract historical information from old photographs, identifying equipment, reading insignia, and even determining specific dates and locations from background details. In March 2018, Dr. Foster was contacted by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History about a project to digitize and catalog the complete photographic collection related to Camp Shelby. The collection included thousands of images spanning from World War I through the present day, many of which had never been properly preserved or made available to researchers. Dr. Foster, said Margaret Williams, the department's chief archivist, during their initial phone conversation, "We have boxes of photographs that haven't been examined by professional historians in decades. Some are in excellent condition, others are deteriorating rapidly. We need someone with your expertise to help us identify what we have and prioritize preservation efforts." The project was exactly the type of work Dr. Foster loved, diving deep into historical archives, uncovering forgotten stories, and using modern technology to reveal details that previous generations of researchers had missed. She arranged to begin work at the archives in Jackson, Mississippi, the following week. The Camp Shelby collection was housed in climate-controlled storage, organized roughly by decade and military unit. Dr. Foster began with the World War II materials, which comprised the largest portion of the collection. She worked systematically, examining each photograph for historical significance, condition, and potential research value. It was during her third week at the archives that she encountered Lieutenant Morrison's July 4, 1943 photograph. The image was in excellent condition, protected by proper archival storage for over 70 years. Dr. Foster immediately recognized its historical value. It was a perfect example of military life documentation from the war's middle period, when American morale was high and victory seemed achievable. Following her standard procedure, Dr. Foster had the photograph professionally scanned at ultra-high resolution, 2400 dpi, which allowed for extreme digital magnification without loss of detail. She then began her systematic analysis, examining every element of the image for historical information. She identified unit patches, equipment types, architectural details, and even weather conditions. Everything in the photograph aligned perfectly with what she knew about Camp Shelby in July 1943. The uniforms were regulation issue for the period. The buildings matched architectural plans from the base's wartime construction, and the soldiers' ages and ranks appeared consistent with the 37th Infantry Division's composition. It was while examining the soldiers' faces that Dr. Foster first noticed something that made her pause. In the left portion of the photograph, partially obscured by the shadow cast by a barracks building, stood a soldier who seemed somehow familiar. The man was tall, probably in his early 20s, with dark hair and distinctive facial features, a strong jawline, and piercing eyes that seemed to stare directly at the camera. Dr. Foster enhanced that section of the image, adjusting contrast and brightness to bring out details in the shadowed area. As the soldier's features became clearer, she felt a growing sense of recognition. She had seen this face before, but where? That evening, Dr. Foster returned to her hotel room with digital copies of the photograph on her laptop. She spent hours examining the mysterious soldier's face, trying to place where she had encountered it before. The answer came to her suddenly, with a chill that made her sit back in her chair. She had seen this face in another photograph, one that had been taken 6 weeks earlier. Dr. Foster immediately called her research assistant at the University of Mississippi. "Jenny, I need you to access our digital database of 37th Infantry Division casualty photographs. Look for casualties from May and June 1943, specifically men who died before July 4th. "Dr. Foster, it's almost midnight," Jenny protested. "Can't this wait until morning?" "No, it can't. This is urgent. I'll stay on the line while you search." 20 minutes later, Jenny's voice came back on the line, tense with excitement. "Dr. Foster, I found something. Private First Class Michael O'Sullivan, 37th Infantry Division, killed in action during a training exercise on June 18, 1943. There's a memorial photograph of him in dress uniform taken just before his unit shipped out to Camp Shelby. Dr. Foster's hands trembled as she opened the image Jenny sent to her laptop. The memorial photograph showed a young soldier in dress uniform posed formally against a plain background. The face was unmistakably identical to the soldier in the July 4th celebration photograph. Jenny, you're certain about the date of death? Absolutely. June 18th, 1943. The records show he was killed in a live-fire training accident. There was an investigation, condolence letters sent to his family in Boston, the whole standard procedure for training fatalities. Dr. Foster stared at her computer screen, looking back and forth between the two photographs. The dates were clear, the identity was unmistakable, and the implications were impossible to ignore. According to official military records, Private First Class Michael O'Sullivan had died 16 days before the July 4th celebration at Camp Shelby. Yet there he was, clearly visible in Lieutenant Morrison's photograph, apparently celebrating Independence Day with his fellow soldiers. Jenny, Dr. Foster said slowly, I need you to pull everything we have on Michael O'Sullivan. Military service records, casualty reports, family correspondence, anything and everything. And I need it first thing tomorrow morning. Is everything all right, Dr. Foster? You sound shaken. Dr. Foster looked at the two photographs one more time, trying to find some logical explanation for what she was seeing. I'm not sure, Jenny. I may have just discovered something that's going to turn World War II military history on its head. She hung up the phone and continued staring at the images until well past 2 a.m., searching for any detail that might explain how a dead soldier could appear in a photograph taken weeks after his official death. If you're finding this story intriguing so far, please leave a comment about what you think might be happening here. The next morning, Dr. Foster arrived at the archives with a sense of urgency she hadn't felt since her graduate school days. Jenny had worked through the night, compiling everything available about Private First Class Michael O'Sullivan, and the file she had prepared was both comprehensive and deeply troubling. Michael Patrick O'Sullivan, born March 15, 1921, in Boston, Massachusetts, had been drafted into the Army in October 1942. He completed basic training at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and was assigned to Company B, 148th Infantry Regiment, 37th Infantry Division. His military records showed him to be an exemplary soldier, physically fit, mentally sharp, and well regarded by his superiors. The most disturbing document in the file was the official casualty report dated June 18, 1943. According to the report, filed by Captain Harold Brennan, O'Sullivan had been killed during a live ammunition training exercise when a mortar round detonated prematurely. The incident occurred at approximately 14:30 hours during routine combat simulation training. O'Sullivan was pronounced dead at the scene by base medical personnel. Dr. Foster studied the casualty report carefully. It included all the standard documentation, witness statements from other soldiers, a report from the base medical officer, and notification letters sent to O'Sullivan's next of kin. The paperwork appeared to be completely authentic and properly filed according to military regulations of the period. But there were aspects of the case that struck Dr. Foster as unusual. The witness statements, while consistent in their basic facts, seemed oddly vague about specific details. Most concerning was that the incident report mentioned only 3 witnesses to the actual explosion, despite the training exercise involving an entire company of over 100 men. Something about this doesn't add up, Dr. Foster muttered to herself as she examined the documents. A mortar accident during training should have had dozens of witnesses, not just 3. Margaret Williams, the chief archivist, approached Dr. Foster's work table. Finding anything interesting in the Camp Shelby collection? Dr. Foster looked up from the papers spread across the table. Margaret, I need to ask you something confidential. In your experience with military records, how common were falsified casualty reports during World War II? Margaret's expression became serious. That's a loaded question, Dr. Foster. Officially, such things were extremely rare. Unofficially, she paused, looking around to ensure they weren't being overheard. There were situations where soldiers might be reported as killed in action for reasons other than actual death. Desertion, espionage investigations, witness protection. The military had ways of making people disappear when necessary. This possibility had occurred to Dr. Foster, but hearing it confirmed by someone with decades of archival experience made it seem more plausible. What would be the procedure for something like that? It would require authorization at the highest levels, probably division command or higher. The soldier would need new identity documents, reassignment to a different unit, and complete separation from anyone who knew them previously. It was complex and rarely used, but it did happen. Dr. Foster spent the remainder of the morning researching similar cases. She discovered that during World War II, there were indeed instances where soldiers' deaths were fabricated for security reasons. Men who had witnessed classified information, discovered enemy espionage activities, or become involved in sensitive intelligence operations were sometimes officially killed and given new identities. But if Michael O'Sullivan had been given a new identity for security reasons, why would he appear in a widely distributed photograph just weeks later? It seemed to defeat the entire purpose of the deception. That afternoon, Dr. Foster made a decision that would transform her investigation. She contacted the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, Missouri, and requested O'Sullivan's complete military personnel file. She also reached out to the Boston Public Library to research O'Sullivan's family background and any surviving relatives. The response from St. Louis came back within 48 hours, and it was devastating. According to the National Personnel Record Center, Michael O'Sullivan's complete military file had been destroyed in the catastrophic fire of 1973 that consumed millions of military records. Only fragmentary information remained: basic service dates, unit assignments, and the casualty report that Dr. Foster had already seen. "This is incredibly frustrating," Dr. Foster confided to Jenny during a phone call. "The one case where we desperately need complete records, and they've been destroyed. It's almost too convenient." The research into O'Sullivan's family background proved more fruitful. The Boston Public Library's genealogy department located records showing that Michael was the youngest of 4 children born to Patrick and Rose O'Sullivan, Irish immigrants who had settled in Boston's South End in 1920. Michael had 2 older brothers, Thomas and James, and 1 sister, Catherine. Most significantly, the library records showed that Catherine O'Sullivan had married a man named Robert Morrison in 1945 and had lived in Boston until her death in 1998. Dr. Foster realized with excitement that Catherine's married name was Morrison, the same surname as Lieutenant Robert Morrison, the photographer who had taken the mysterious July 4th photograph. "Jenny, we need to find out if there's any connection between Lieutenant Robert Morrison and Catherine O'Sullivan Morrison. This could be the key to understanding what really happened." The connection, when Dr. Foster discovered it, was both illuminating and puzzling. Military records showed that Lieutenant Robert Morrison had indeed married Catherine O'Sullivan in Boston in September 1945, 2 years after the war ended. But the records also showed that Lieutenant Morrison had been born and raised in Rochester, New York, and had no family connections to Boston before meeting Catherine. Dr. Foster found herself facing several possible explanations, none of which seemed entirely satisfactory. First, the simplest explanation was that she had misidentified the soldier in the photograph. Perhaps the resemblance to Michael O'Sullivan was coincidental, and the man in the July 4th image was simply another soldier with similar features. Second, Michael O'Sullivan's death might have been falsified for security reasons, and he had been given a new identity but had carelessly appeared in the photograph before being properly relocated. Third, the photograph itself might have been manipulated or mislabeled, though this seemed unlikely given the archival documentation and the photographic evidence. Fourth, and most disturbing, was the possibility that something genuinely unexplainable had occurred, that Michael O'Sullivan had somehow appeared in the photograph despite being dead. As Dr. Foster prepared to dig deeper into the connection between the photographer and O'Sullivan's family, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was uncovering something much larger and more complex than a simple case of mistaken identity. Dr. Foster's investigation into the Morrison-O'Sullivan connection led her to make a discovery that complicated the mystery even further. Through military personnel records, she learned that Lieutenant Robert Morrison had been transferred to the European theater in September 1943, just 2 months after taking the controversial July 4th photograph. He had served as a combat photographer during the Italian campaign, documenting some of the war's bloodiest battles. What made this timeline particularly interesting was that Morrison's transfer had been sudden and unexpected. According to his service records, he had originally been scheduled to remain at Camp Shelby through early 1944, training other military photographers. Instead, he was abruptly reassigned to the Fifth Army in Italy, arriving there in October 1943. "There's something here that doesn't add up," Dr. Foster told Jenny during one of their regular research calls. Military photographers weren't typically transferred so quickly during this period. The Army invested significant time training them, and they usually remained with their assigned units for extended periods. Dr. Foster decided to research Morrison's activities in Italy, hoping to find clues about his sudden transfer. Through the National Archives, she obtained copies of Morrison's combat photography portfolio from the Italian campaign. The images were professionally executed and historically valuable, showing American forces advancing through difficult terrain against determined German resistance. But it was while examining these combat photographs that Dr. Foster made another disturbing discovery. In several images taken near Monte Cassino in November 1943, she spotted a figure that looked remarkably similar to the mysterious soldier from the July 4th Camp Shelby photograph. The combat photographs showed American soldiers taking a brief rest during their advance up the Italian peninsula. In the background of one image, partially obscured by smoke from nearby artillery fire, stood a soldier whose profile matched the controversial figure from Camp Shelby. Dr. Foster enhanced the image using the same digital techniques she had applied to the July 4th photograph. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same distinctive jawline, the same piercing eyes, the same overall facial structure. If this was indeed Michael O'Sullivan, it meant he had somehow appeared in photographs taken in 2 different locations, Mississippi and Italy, spanning a period of 5 months after his official death. Dr. Foster realized she needed to approach this mystery from a different angle. Instead of focusing solely on Michael O'Sullivan's alleged death, she decided to investigate what had actually happened during the training exercise on June 18, 1943, that supposedly killed him. Through military archives and veteran interviews, she managed to locate 3 men who had served in O'Sullivan's company during the period in question. 2 were willing to speak with her, though their memories of events from 75 years earlier were understandably vague. Frank Kowalski, 94 years old and living in a Veterans Administration facility in Cleveland, remembered the June 18th incident clearly. "Oh yeah, the mortar accident," he said during Dr. Foster's phone interview. "Terrible thing. But you know, it was funny. We never saw Mickey's body after it happened." "Mickey?" Dr. Foster asked. "Michael O'Sullivan. We called him Mickey. Nice kid from Boston. Real quiet. Kept to himself mostly. But after that mortar went off, the officers rushed everyone away from the area real quick. Said it was too dangerous. Unexploded ordnance everywhere. We never got to see what happened to Mickey." The second veteran, Arthur Chen from San Francisco, provided an even more intriguing account. "I was maybe 50 yards away when that mortar went off," Chen recalled. "Big explosion, lots of smoke. But here's the thing. I could have sworn I saw Mickey running away from the blast area afterward. When I mentioned it to the sergeant, he told me I was mistaken, that the smoke and confusion had made me see things that weren't there." These interviews suggested that Michael O'Sullivan's death might indeed have been fabricated, but they didn't explain why or what had happened to him afterward. Dr. Foster decided to pursue the connection between Lieutenant Morrison and Catherine O'Sullivan, hoping it might provide crucial missing pieces of the puzzle. Through genealogy records and marriage licenses, Dr. Foster traced how Robert Morrison and Catherine O'Sullivan had met. According to a 1945 newspaper announcement of their engagement in the Boston Herald, they had been introduced by mutual friends in early 1945, shortly after Morrison returned from the European theatre. But Dr. Foster's research revealed something that the newspaper announcement had not mentioned. Catherine O'Sullivan had been working during the war as a clerk for the War Department's Casualty Notification Office in Boston. Her job involved processing death notifications and corresponding with families of soldiers killed in action. This meant that Catherine would have had access to detailed information about military casualties, including her brother Michael's alleged death. She would have known exactly what paperwork had been filed, who had been notified, and what the official story was regarding the circumstances of his death. Dr. Foster began to suspect that the connection between Catherine O'Sullivan and Robert Morrison might not have been the coincidence it appeared to be. Morrison was the photographer who had captured the mysterious image of Michael O'Sullivan alive weeks after his supposed death. Catherine was Michael's sister and a War Department employee with access to casualty records. Had they met by coincidence in 1945, or had Catherine deliberately sought out the photographer who might hold the key to her brother's fate? Dr. Foster's investigation led her to examine Morrison's post-war life more closely. After marrying Catherine, he had settled in Boston and worked as a commercial photographer until his retirement in 1985. The couple had raised 3 children and lived quietly in a suburb west of the city. Morrison had rarely spoken about his war experiences, even to his family. According to his obituary in the Boston Globe in 2001, Morrison had been a devoted husband and father who enjoyed photography as both profession and hobby. But the obituary mentioned something that caught Dr. Foster's attention. Morrison had maintained an extensive archive of his wartime photographs, which he had donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society shortly before his death. If you're enjoying this mystery so far, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support really helps me continue creating content like this. Dr. Foster immediately contacted the Massachusetts Historical Society to inquire about Morrison's photographic archive. The response she received would lead to the most shocking discovery of her entire investigation. The Massachusetts Historical Society's response to Dr. Foster's inquiry was both helpful and puzzling. Yes, they confirmed, Robert Morrison had indeed donated his wartime photographic archive to the Society in 2000. The collection included hundreds of photographs from both his time at Camp Shelby and his combat photography service in Italy. However, there was something unusual about the donation. Mr. Morrison was very specific about access to his collection, explained Dr. Sarah Hamilton, the Society's chief curator. He stipulated that certain photographs could only be viewed by qualified researchers, and only with the written permission of his family. He seemed particularly concerned about images that might contain sensitive historical information. Dr. Foster obtained the necessary permissions from Morrison's surviving children and traveled to Boston to examine the archive. What she found there would fundamentally change her understanding of the entire mystery. Morrison's personal collection included multiple prints of the July 4, 1943 Camp Shelby photograph, but they weren't identical to the version Dr. Foster had been studying. In Morrison's personal files, there were several different versions of the same scene, taken from slightly different angles and at different moments during the Independence Day celebration. Most significantly, Morrison had preserved the photographic negatives along with detailed notes about each image. His handwritten documentation for the July 4th photographs included something that made Dr. Foster's pulse quicken. M.O. Special circumstances, CO approval required for publication. The initials M.O. clearly referred to Michael O'Sullivan, and the notation about commanding officer approval suggested that Morrison had been aware there was something sensitive about O'Sullivan's appearance in the photographs. But it was Morrison's combat photography from Italy that provided the most revealing information. Among his Italian photographs, Dr. Foster found a series of images that had never been included in any official military documentation. These photographs, taken near Monte Cassino in late 1943, clearly showed American soldiers engaged in what appeared to be intelligence operations rather than standard combat activities. One photograph showed several soldiers examining German documents in what looked like a captured command post. Another showed American personnel interrogating German prisoners. But most importantly, several of these intelligence photographs clearly showed the same figure that Dr. Foster had identified as Michael O'Sullivan. Morrison's notes for these photographs were more detailed and more revealing. For the images showing O'Sullivan, Morrison had written, M.O. Intelligence Liaison, cover identity maintained, photos classified per G2 instructions. G2 was military intelligence. The notation suggested that Michael O'Sullivan had been working in some form of intelligence capacity and that his cover identity needed to be protected. This would explain why he had been officially declared dead. It was a way of removing him from normal military records while allowing him to operate in intelligence roles. Dr. Foster realized she was looking at evidence of a sophisticated intelligence operation. Michael O'Sullivan had likely been recruited for intelligence work, officially declared dead to protect his cover, and then deployed to Italy, where he worked in covert operations against German forces. But this explanation, while logical, still didn't account for all the evidence. Why had Morrison been so careful to document O'Sullivan's presence in photographs if the operation was meant to be secret? And why had he preserved this evidence for over 50 years? The answer came in a letter Dr. Foster found in Morrison's personal papers, written in 1999 and addressed to whom it may concern. The letter was Morrison's explanation of the photographs and his decision to preserve them. For over 50 years, I have carried the burden of knowing that official military records contain false information about the death of Private First Class Michael O'Sullivan. I was present when the decision was made to declare him killed in action, and I understood the military necessity of this deception at the time. Michael was recruited by military intelligence for operations in occupied Europe. His knowledge of German language and his physical resemblance to certain German soldiers made him valuable for infiltration missions. The fake death was designed to protect both him and his family from potential German retaliation. I have maintained photographic evidence of Michael's survival because I believe history deserves an accurate record, even if that record cannot be made public during the lifetimes of those involved. I've also maintained this evidence because Michael's sister, Catherine, has never stopped believing that her brother might have survived, despite the official notification of his death. I met Catherine in 1945 when she contacted me about the July 4th photograph. She had obtained a copy through War Department channels and had recognized her brother in the image. Instead of exposing the truth, which could have endangered ongoing intelligence operations, I chose to marry her and spend my life protecting both Michael's secret and her hope. Michael O'Sullivan completed several successful intelligence missions in occupied Europe between 1943 and 1945, After the war, he was given a new identity and relocated to South America, where he lived until his natural death in 1987. Catherine never knew that I maintained contact with her brother throughout those years, and she never knew that the photographs she treasured actually proved he had survived. Dr. Foster sat in the quiet reading room of the Massachusetts Historical Society, staring at Robert Morrison's letter and trying to process its implications. The mystery of the July 4th photograph had been solved, but the solution raised new questions about the ethics of wartime deception, the nature of family loyalty, and the price of keeping secrets. She had uncovered a story of military intelligence operations, false death records, covert missions, and a photographer who had spent 50 years protecting both state secrets and his wife's emotional well-being. But she had also discovered evidence that official World War II records contained deliberate falsifications that had never been corrected. Dr. Foster realized she faced the same dilemma that Robert Morrison had wrestled with for decades. Should she publish her findings and correct the historical record, potentially affecting the families involved? Should she keep the secret, as Morrison had done? Or was there some middle ground that would serve both historical truth and human dignity? As she prepared to leave Boston with copies of Morrison's photographs and documentation, Dr. Foster knew that her discovery would force military historians to reconsider how many other official casualty records from World War II might contain similar deceptions. The question was no longer just what had happened to Michael O'Sullivan, but how many other soldiers had been officially erased from history for reasons that might never be fully understood. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a comment below. I'd love to know what you thought about this historical mystery and where you're listening from. It would be a pleasure to hear from you. Which aspect of this story did you find most compelling? Leave your thoughts in the comments and let's discuss this fascinating case. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos exploring more hidden mysteries from the past.